So Russian forces may have just broken through Ukrainian lines north of Pokrovsk, which, if this report is true, would be a major problem for Ukrainian forces in the near term as they try to hold on in Donetsk. Now, strangely, this report is only coming from Ukraine-aligned channels and sources. I'm not seeing this mentioned at all, let alone celebrated in Russian media. Now, starting out with a look at this little area of a breakthrough, which it's small, all things considered, but when you compare it to how the war has played out in recent months and years, it is significant. So we're starting here with Deep State Map, where the original report of this breakthrough came about, and we're going to zoom into Pokrovsk here. And we've talked about Pokrovsk in quite a few recent videos because it is a significant cauldron being formed here and the focus of Russian offensive operations. This area here in the north, just to the east of Dobropilya, is where this breakthrough may have just occurred in the last 24, maybe 48 hours. So to go back a few days, if we go back to August 1st on Deep State Map here, one of the reasons I like this is you can bounce back and forth between dates. And I want you to watch this area here, north of Verdinsky. While most of the concern was that they might try to move around west or even south and cut off Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk, it looks like, at least according to the Deep State Map, Russia may have made a bit of a sprint further north. So just shifting day by day, we saw a pretty expected movement and then all of a sudden a pretty big jump. In fact, if we look at the ruler here, just to give you an idea, and that's the gray zone it's marking, but that's 11 kilometers that went from controlled by Ukraine to at least gray zone, contested territory, and this stretch right here, at least the limit of Russian forces, 5 kilometers in the span of a day. We don't see that anywhere else along the front. You don't see that movement. We haven't for a long time. Maybe if you go up to some of the Kursk offensive operations when Ukraine was first breaking in about a year ago, and then at the very end when they were being pushed out, you saw a Ukrainian retreat. There was movement of 5 kilometers a day, not near Pokrovsk. So this is a pretty significant shift. Now, the issue here is not only Pokrovsk, but as they push north, should Russia decide to kind of split the difference here between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, it would put both of these areas at risk. Again, the possibility of other cauldrons forming along these lines. Now, anytime that Russia or Ukraine pushes out like this, they, of course, do put their own logistics and supply lines at risk. You have to assume that Ukraine has the ability to hit these lines right in here pretty heavily. Either way, this right here, not being reported on other channels. And I want to show you that real quick. Deep State Map, what we would normally expect in this situation of a Russian advance, the way it is played out generally throughout the entire war, is at this point, Russia would be celebrating it. They'd be bragging about it, sometimes thinking that they were maybe a little further than they actually are, and Ukrainian channels would generally be quiet. And then over time, we would get evidence, maybe videos from above or confirmation, and you'd find out, okay, Russia did make this advance. And the same is true when Ukraine moves into Russian-held territory. The first reports come from Ukraine, and we wait a while for Russia to actually verify that they lost territory. In this case, we have Ukraine first and the only ones reporting a loss of territory, and a significant chunk at that. And it's just not popping up on Russian channels at all, which is very strange. Shifting over to another map here, Syriac map, that generally tends to be more agreeable to Russian sources is maybe the way to put it. And we see in Syriac map, when there's just a picture of a Russian with a flag somewhere, they tend to pretty quickly say Russia now has that territory. You'll notice they have not updated their map to show this move. There's Deep State, there's Syriac. They've not shown the same level of advance. And even moving over to some Russian mill bloggers, this map put together by War Gonzo, also not talking about, it would be over here on the left part of the screen, also not showing this recent advance north of Pokrovsk. So something strange. I can't exactly put my finger on what happened quite yet. We don't have any visual confirmation from what I've been able to come across, but we will keep an eye out for that. Now, in talking about the situation at Pokrovsk, Bakhmut Demon, a Ukrainian source there, said, quote, "At night and early morning, there was an active attempt to storm and secure the positions of the enemy in the residential areas of Pokrovsk, probably on the south and southeast. Earlier, assault groups probed the access routes to Pokrovsk and were caught right in the center. The enemy planned routes and tried to storm with a large number of personnel. The fighting is still ongoing. Most of the enemy forces have been eliminated, but we are expecting another wave. It seems the enemy, as mentioned before, has thrown everything they have here, and their operational speed will increase. They're in a hurry, but we also have some surprises. Now, if you recall, and we're going to get into the ceasefire talks here in a moment, one of the asks by Putin is all of Donetsk be handed over to Russia. So you could kind of interpret that a couple ways. Maybe they decide to sit back and wait and see how the ceasefire talks actually go, and who knows? Unfortunately, at this point, it looks like the United States might be on board with trying to give over some Ukrainian territory, so Putin does have that option. Conversely, he might try to increase the scope of operations, the pace of operations in the near term, to make it seem to the United States and others involved with Ukraine at the negotiating table, why not just give it over now instead of risk losing more territory at gunpoint? So if they see Ukraine losing territory day by day, my gut says that the United States is probably going to lean more in the camp of, let's just negotiate that so you don't lose more soldiers. I mean, when you hear anybody, senior U.S. officials talk right now, it's always about stopping the killing, right? Vice President Vance today did some news segments, and he over and over and over again stressed the priority was stopping the killing. That would line up with their narrative of stopping the killing. Cede that territory back. You're already losing troops. You're losing territory today or over the course of the last couple of days. Stop the bloodshed. You can see how that might line up with U.S. talking points. Now, continuing with Pokrovsk here, briefly, there is an interesting report by Deep State Map that kind of lines up with some footage we've seen out of the area in recent days, talking about how they've uncovered 150 sabotage or groups of upwards, a total number of 150 Russians included in sabotage groups trying to probe into Pokrovsk over the course of the last few weeks. They say, according to our information, the enemy formed tactical groups of 50 people each from 3 companies for sabotage actions in Pokrovsk. The goal of the operation was to create panic and force the units to flee the city. Now, we do have some video of 1, 2, 3 soldiers wandering around Pokrovsk and some of the outskirts over the course of the last couple weeks, and it looks like this is exactly what Deep State Map is talking about. They say the entire route to Pokrovsk took the Russians 14 days, 4 days to the industrial area, and 10 days into the center of Pokrovsk. Thus, each day the enemy infantrymen covered only 600 meters, hoping not to be detected. Communications, food, and water were provided by drone drops. Therefore, there's good coordination between the groups, and everyone knew about each other. They used cloaks for camouflage and hidden random shelters. The saboteurs had route trackers to follow their paths. About 120 out of 150 people died. Possibly some managed to survive after being wounded. On July 19th, the groups began to infiltrate Pokrovsk and carry out sabotage operations. The search for the remnants of the groups continues. This week, more Russian saboteurs surrendered. Accordingly, the operation did not achieve its goal, although it caused many problems for the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Can a plan be considered successful if 80% of the personnel must die on the way to the task location? So again, a new-ish tactic sort of that we're seeing carried out by Russia, where a lot of small groups are probing around trying to find a gap in Ukrainian defenses, dig in, and possibly call up reinforcements. In this case, specifically around Pokrovsk, it sounds like they moved up, but maybe did not get any of those reinforcements. And as mentioned a couple days ago, we are getting more confirmation that Ukraine is actually sending out their own special operations hunting teams, is probably the right way to put it, to locate these small sabotage groups and eliminate them. Now, a couple other areas of the front where we've seen some action in recent days. I want to move up to Kupyansk, and this is an interesting one because it directly contradicts kind of what we're seeing in Pokrovsk. Kupyansk up here, we made a video recently talking about how the challenge or an issue here for Ukrainian forces was that Russia started to advance around the western portion of the city. The green here, for what it's worth, is Ukrainian-held territory, as is the tan, the red being Russian-occupied territory. And just earlier last week, we saw Russian forces move around to the west of Kupyansk and take a video showing that they were in this town here, Sobolivka. And the initial thought was, all right, the Russian forces have made a significant move. They might be on the verge of encircling the town. But just as of today, that seems to not be the case. Multiple maps, including Russian and Ukrainian source maps and Russian sources, have kind of walked back any claims that Russia has actually moved into this village, which, again, very different. So Russia quickly claimed that. Some Russian sources, not all, some quickly claimed that they had that territory based off of one video of somebody with a flag on the ground. We haven't even seen that much in the area of Pokrovsk. Now, shifting south a little bit to Liman, This was an area we covered in a recent video as well, where we saw an increase in Russian attacks near Torsky. And just overnight, the last couple days, we've seen a significant increase in Russian motorcycle assaults. In fact, the 63rd Brigade, 63rd Mechanized Brigade out of Ukraine, put together this video showing just the constant drone strikes against these motorcycle forces. And we talked about it in a recent video. One of the challenges that Russia has in their assaulting here is, by and large, to the south of Torsky, there are some woodlands, some forested areas that are very hard to move any significant number of personnel through. Ukraine has significant drone overwatch. And to the north of Torsky, they have some water features that Russia is not going to be able to bypass or go through. So it's somewhat of a head-on assault in this area. And the tactic we're seeing Russia use more and more recently is, rather than a large, squad or company-sized mechanized element that would risk losing those armored vehicles, they're sending more and more forward in ATVs, or, like this video shows, motorcycles. So the Torsky is the area actually where we saw a lot of the caltrops being used recently, if you recall, dropping the metal spikes on the ground to pop the tires of the motorcycles, and then making the dismounted infantry pretty easy targets. Now, going back to the map here and shifting to the last area I want to talk about in terms of battlefield updates, down here near Zaporizhia, this is another area that we've seen Russian forces advance in recent days and kind of focus a bit of their offensive operations. It does look like this deep state map setup might be a little bit behind, at least according to some Russian sources. Paratrooper's diary says, quote, "Airborne units are advancing despite numerous enemy counterattacks, as well as the high intensity of enemy drone strikes of all types. Assault groups of the 7th Airborne Assault Brigade have already secured Stepnohirsk, right here a little bit to the north." And that's where I say this map might be a little dated at this point, because Russia is already saying at the very least this area is being fought over. They say it cannot yet be stated that it is confidently controlled. This area is all mixed up. We are advancing from the eastern side of the settlement as well, encircling Stepnohirsk from several flanks at once. At the same time, the enemy not only uses small infantry groups, but also employs motorized vehicles for attacks in small groups of 6 units. He says, in fact, the situation here is extremely difficult. The enemy suppressed our drones with electronic warfare and deployed groups on quad bikes, and we cannot observe their movements from the air, but our comrades at the position did not flinch. There are also reports, they say, of Baba Yaga-type drones approximately 50 kilometers from the front line, suggesting that Ukraine is mining some of the approaches. It wasn't clear if they were talking about some of the approaches on the Russian side or mining some of the approaches back behind Ukraine to stop Russia should they break through here at Stepnohirsk. And the last one to bring up here, up near Bryansk, there have been some reports in recent days that Ukraine may be trying to push into this area. The Wagner Telegram channel, of all things, mentioned that just yesterday at 6 a.m., a special unit of the Ukrainian Armed Forces was detected trying to cross into Bryansk. They say border guards and the scouts, and they did show some video of this, they say border guards identified the enemy and opened fire. The Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance group suffered losses and entered a minefield while trying to evacuate their severely wounded fighters. After that, the saboteurs were hit by fire from howitzers, artillery, MLRS, and mortars. There's actually been a fair amount of talk of Ukraine trying to kick off some sort of offensive operation in Bryansk and the possibility of a Ukrainian offensive elsewhere along the front. We're seeing both sides, for the first time in a while, be kind of nervous about some sort of counterattack, counteroffensive being put together. I haven't seen anything materialize from that other than just concerns, but notable that both sides are mentioning that more and more. Now, yesterday, we also started to see just the continuation of Ukrainian deep strikes into Russian territory. Yesterday, they came in the form of the Ukrainian SBUs, saying they carried out a long-range strike that hit a Shahhead production facility and a facility where these Shahheads and their components are stored in Tatarstan, which is about 1,300 kilometers away from Ukraine. I've not seen the details of where this drone may have been launched from. 1,300 kilometers is very long range for a drone strike. We've seen Ukraine carry these out at 6, 7, 8, 900 kilometers, I believe. I don't know if we've seen anything quite this far away from Ukrainian territory. The SBU said they continue their consistent work to demilitarize Russian military facilities deep in enemy territory. Warehouses storing Shahheads, which the enemy uses to terrorize Ukraine every night, are legitimate military targets. Each successful special operation reduces the enemy's capability to wage an aggressive war against Ukraine. And then last night, again, we saw Ukraine go after some oil refineries. This one, the Saratov oil refinery, and the Russian report of this one coming from Rybar. They say Ukrainian forces continue attempts to attack oil and gas infrastructure facilities and disrupt the operation of the country's airports. The main goal pursued by the enemy is to inflict significant economic damage. Again, the Russian source Rybar says despite the large number of drones launched, damage was recorded at only one facility. In all other cases, Ukrainian UAVs were intercepted thanks to the effective work of air defense and a whole set of previously developed and implemented measures. And of course, we have a fair amount of footage showing the burning oil facilities. That always makes for pretty interesting videos. But moving on then to the ceasefire talks we've been trying to keep up with in recent days. As a bit of a background, President Trump is set to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday, August 15th. As of now, it does not sound like Ukrainian President Zelensky will be present for that. We did get, unfortunately, yesterday we talked in the video about how Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy trying to negotiate this settlement, may have made a pretty significant blunder in mixing something up. And we got more details on that. It looks like it genuinely did happen, which is infuriating. But this is according to some reports by the Wall Street Journal, where they say on the call, Trump suggested that Russia would be ready to withdraw from the southern region of Zaporizhia and Kherson in exchange for full control of Donetsk. So Russia withdrawing from territories, in exchange, they would get all of Donetsk. Ukraine would have to withdraw from that territory. They say, however, Witkoff walked back that claim the next day in a call with the chief aides of the European leaders, suggesting that Russia would both withdraw and freeze the front lines at the same time. I don't know what that means. That seems like a contradiction. And then on Friday, so the third call, European officials demanded a third call with Witkoff to clarify the growing confusion about what Putin actually proposed. In that call, Witkoff stated that the only offer on the table was for Ukraine to withdraw unilaterally from Donetsk in exchange for a ceasefire. So that's where we're back to, is essentially the Russian demand that Ukraine withdraw from any territory along the lines that they're still holding in exchange for nothing, or the possibility that a ceasefire may actually go into effect. Now, the European Union, a bunch of leaders of the European Union met yesterday and issued a statement to this end, kind of their response to what has come out so far, and it was pretty bland, is probably the best way to put it. They said things like, we are convinced that only an approach that combines active diplomacy, support to Ukraine, and pressure on the Russian Federation to end their illegal war can succeed. They talked about how they will continue to pursue their and Ukraine's vital interests, and Ukraine has the freedom of choice over its own destiny. Pretty vague, all things considered. And, for better or for worse, they're not addressing some of the issues that have come up so far in the reporting, but to be fair, most of that is still generally speculation. We did today get a little more of an indication of where the United States may be coming down in some of these ceasefire negotiations, and my read of this is that we are getting ready, kind of setting the stage to hand Putin additional territory from Ukraine. One of the reasons I say that is Senator Lindsey Graham, historically one of the more hawkish members of the Senate, one of the more hawkish members towards the war in Ukraine that is in Trump's good graces right now, he just today was asked the question of, if you cede territory to Ukraine, isn't that just setting up future problems? And he kind of talked around that. Anyways, that's my read. Let's give it a quick listen.
Senator, let me just read you something that you said back in 2023 as we talk about these potential land swaps that you're discussing. This was during your visit to Ukraine. You said, quote, "You don't end wars by giving territory to the aggressor. If Putin is not stopped here, he will keep going. And that increases the chances that there will be a war between Russia and NATO." Senator, if Russia is allowed to annex some of those regions, won't that effectively be a green light for Russia to go into and invade other countries?
What will stop a third war is to do things differently than we did in 2022. is to keep arming Ukraine so that Russia will be deterred by the most lethal army on the continent of Europe right now, which is Ukraine. Security guarantees that if you come into Ukraine again, you'll be fighting more than just Ukraine. Having some European forces on the ground as tripwires, building up economic integration. The one thing that changed everything, in my view, is the minerals deal between us and Ukraine changed the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, and President Trump will defend those interests.
All right, so that is something that hasn't come up quite yet in this round of negotiations, are the security guarantees, the continued arming of Ukraine. Those are things that Russia has said before is a hard line. And based off of what looks like our complete misunderstanding of what Putin asked of Witkoff in the meeting, I feel like we probably just don't have the updated story on that one. But nonetheless, that would be significant, right? This is something that Zelensky has pushed for since day one, and it's an understandable ask, is some sort of security guarantee, no matter what the peace deal is, so we can be sure that Putin doesn't just pause and do this again at some point in the future. However, I have to point out that in that statement there, Graham did not draw that hard line and say something like, we will not reward the aggressors like he has previously, or we will not give in to his demands. He's said that not that long ago. Today, when asked that same question, he kind of changes the dynamic and talks about, well, there's some other things we could do as well. I felt like it was a similar statement here made by the NATO ambassador, Whitaker, when he was asked about what these ceasefire negotiations look like. And here's what he had to say.
Certainly, I think, I took Zelensky's comments at face value, which is that no big chunks or, sections are going to be just given that haven't been fought for or earned on the battlefield. But I come back to where I started, which is, we need this war to end. We could save thousands of lives with a deal. And I think that by both sides communicating, by President Trump meeting in Alaska on Friday with either one or both of the combatants, I think this is exciting. And I think President Trump's really the only one that could make this happen. He's the sole reason that I think this meeting is happening on Friday. He's a peacemaker. He's averaging about a peace deal a month right now. We saw just this week where Armenia and Azerbaijan came together to settle their decades-long conflict. It's been a series of peace deals. And so, I think President Trump is best situated to see if a deal can be had and if both sides can agree to ending the slaughter.
So I do feel like this one could maybe be interpreted a couple different ways, but big picture, if we're looking at how the United States is approaching these ceasefire talks, you have the U.S. ambassador to NATO saying, I heard President Zelensky say we're not going to give up chunks of territory that Russia has not taken, and his very next word was, but. And then he got into how we have to find a way to bring the war to a close. So again, when looking at Senator Graham and Ambassador Whitaker, both of them don't draw that hard line of we're not just going to give up territory for the sake of trying to get to a peace deal, which makes me think that is very much on the table as we near this, what should be a meeting between President Trump and President Putin this next Friday. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.